Evening all. It's Sunday, it's 8 o'clock. You know what that means. So tonight's story is actually for a very, very dear friend of mine who I miss terribly and haven't seen nearly enough this year, thanks to viral nonsense and 2020 just essentially being 2020. So it's by a brilliant writer called Nigel Kneale, and it's called The Pond. It was deeply scooped from a corner of the field, a green, stagnant hollow with bushes on its banks. From time to time, something moved cautiously beneath the prickly branches that were laden with red autumn berries. It whistled and murmured coaxingly. "Come, come," it whispered. An old man, squatting frog-like on the bank. His words were no louder than the rustling of the dry leaves above his head. "Come now, little dear, here's a bit of meat for thee." He tossed a tiny scrap of something into the pool, and the weed rippled sluggishly. The old man sighed and shifted his position. He was crouching on his haunches because the bank was damp. He froze. The green slime had parted at the far side of the pool. The disturbance travelled to the bank opposite, and a large frog drew itself half out of the water. It stayed quite still, watching. Then with a swift crawl it was clear of the water. Its yellow throat throbbed. "Oh, little dear," breathed the old man. He didn't move. He waited, letting the frog grow accustomed to the air and the slippery earth. When he judged the moment to be right, he made a low grating noise in his throat. He saw the frog listen. The sound was subtly like the call of its own kind. The old man paused and then made it again. This time the frog answered. It sprang into the pool, sending the green weed slopping, and swam strongly. Only its eyes showed above the water. It crawled out a few feet distant from the old man and looked up the bank, as if eager to find the frog it had heard. The old man waited patiently. The frog hopped twice up the bank. His hand was moving so slowly that it didn't seem to move, towards the handle of the light net at his side. He gripped it, still watching for the frog. Suddenly he struck. A sweep of the net and its wire frame whacked the ground about the frog. It leapt frantically, but it was helpless in the green mesh. "Oh, my dear," said the old man delightedly. He stood with much difficulty and pain, his foot on the thin rod. His joints had stiffened, and it was some minutes before he could go to the net. The frog was still struggling desperately. He closed the net around its body and picked both up together. "Oh, big beauty," he said. "Pretty handsome fellow, you." He took a darning needle from his coat lapel and carefully killed the creature through the mouth so that its skin would not be damaged. Then he put it in his pocket. It was the last frog in the pond. He lashed the water with the handle, and the weed swirled and bobbed. There was no sign of life now, but the little flies that flitted on the surface. He went across the empty field with the net across his shoulder, shivering a little, feeling that the warmth had gone out of his body during his long wait. He climbed a stile, throwing the net over in front of him to leave his hands free. In the next field by the road was his cottage. Hobbling through the grass, with the sun striking a long shadow from him, he felt the weight of the dead frog in his pocket, and he was glad. "Big beauty," he murmured again. The cottage was small and dry and ugly and very old. Its windows gave little light, and they had coloured panels, dark blue and green, that gave the rooms the appearance of being under the sea. The old man lit a lamp, for the sun had set, and the light became more cheerful. He put the frog on a plate and poked the fire, and when he was warm again he took off his coat. He settled down close beside the lamp and took a sharp knife from the drawer of the table. With great care and patience, he began to skin the frog. From time to time he took off his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. The work was tiring, also the heat from the lamp made them sore. He would speak aloud to the dead creature, coaxing and cajoling it when he found his task difficult. But in time he had the skin neatly removed, a little heap of tumbled slippery film. He dropped the stiff, stripped body into a pan of boiling water on the fire and sat again, humming and fingering the limp skin. "Pretty," he said. "You will be so handsome." There was a stump of black soap in the drawer, and he took it out to rub the skin, with the slow, over-careful motion that showed the age of his hand. The little mottled thing began to stiffen under the curing action. He left it at last, brewed himself a pot of tea, lifting the lid of the simmering pan occasionally to make sure that the tiny skull and bones were being boiled clean without damage. Sipping his tea, he crossed the narrow living room. Well away from the fire stood a high table, its top covered by a square of dark cloth supported on a wire frame. There was a faint smell of decay. "How are you, little dears?" said the old man. He lifted the covering with shaky scrupulousness. Beneath the wire support were dozens of stuffed frogs. They'd all been posed in human attitudes, dressed in tiny coats and breeches to the fashion of an earlier time. There were ladies and gentlemen and bowing flunkies. One, with lace at his yellow waxen throat, held a wooden wine cup. To the dried forepaw of his neighbour was stitched a tiny glass monocle raised to a button eye. A third had a tiny pipe pressed to its jaws with a wisp of wool for smoke. The same coarse wool, cleaned and shaped, served the ladies for their miniature wigs. They wore long skirts and carried fans. The old man looked proudly over at the stiff little figures. "You, my lord, what are you doing with your mouth so glum?" His fingers prized open the jaws of a round-bellied frog dressed in satins. Shrinkage must have closed them. "Now you can sing again and drink up." His eyes searched the banqueting, motionless party. "Where now? Ah ha ha!" In the middle of the table, 3 of the creatures were fixed in the attitudes of a dance. The old man spoke to them. "Soon we'll have a partner for the lady there. He'll be the handsomest of the whole company, my dear. Don't forget to smile at him and look your prettiest." He hurried back to the fireplace and lifted the pan, poured off the steaming water into a bucket. "Finely shaped brain box you have." He picked with his knife, cleaning the tiny skull. "Easy does it." He put it down on the table admiringly. It was like a transparent flake of ivory. One by one he found the delicate bones in the pan, knowing each for what it was. "Now, little Duke, we have all of them that we need," he said at last. "We can make you into a picture indeed, the beau of the ball. And such an object of jealousy for the lovely ladies." With wire and thread, he fashioned a stiff little skeleton, binding the bones to preserve the proportions. At the top went the skull. The frog's skin had lost its earlier flaccidness. He threaded a needle, eyeing it close to the lamp. From the table drawer, he now brought a loose wad of wool. Like a doctor reassuring his patient and describing his methods, he began to talk. "This wool is coarse, I know, little friend. Poor substitute to fill that skin of yours. You may say wool from the hedges, snatched by the thorns from a sheep's back." It was pulling the wad into tufts of the size he required. But you'll find it gives such a springiness that you'll thank me for it now. Carefully does it. With perfect concentration, he worked the needle through the skin, drawing it together around the wool with almost untraceable stitches. A piece of lace in your left hand, or should it be a quizzing glass? With tiny scissors, he trimmed away a fragment of skin. But wait, it's a dance, and it's your right hand that we must see guiding the lady. He worked the skin precisely into place around the skull. He would attend to the empty eye holes later. Suddenly, he lowered his needle. He listened. Puzzled, he put down the half-stuffed skin and went to the door and opened it. The sky was dark now. He heard the sound more clearly. He knew it was coming from the pond, a far-off harsh croaking of a great many frogs. He frowned. In the wall cupboard, he found a lantern ready trimmed, and he lit it with a flickering splinter. He put on an overcoat and hat, remembering his earlier chill. Lastly, he took his net. He went very cautiously. His eyes saw nothing at first after working so close to the lamp. Then, as the croaking came to him more clearly, he grew accustomed to the darkness. He hurried. He climbed the stile as before, throwing the net ahead. This time, however, he had to search for it in the darkness, tantalised by the sounds of the pond. When it was in his hand again, he began to move more stealthily. About 20 yards from the pool, he stopped and listened. There was no wind, and the noise astonished him. Hundreds of frogs must have travelled through the fields to this spot, from other water where danger had arisen, perhaps, or drought. He'd heard of such instances. Almost on tiptoe, he crept towards the pond. He could see nothing yet. There was no moon, and the thorn bushes hid the surface of the water. He was a few paces from the pond when, without warning, every sound ceased. He froze again. There was absolute silence. Not even a watery plop or splashing told that one frog out of all those hundreds had dived for the shelter of the weed. It was strange. He stepped forward and heard his boots brushing the grass. He brought the net up across his chest, ready to strike if he saw anything move. He came to the thorn bushes and still heard no sound. Yet, to judge by the noise they'd made, they should be hopping in dozens from beneath his feet. Peering, he made the throaty noise which had called the frog that afternoon. The hush continued. He looked down at where the water must be. The surface of the pond, shadowed by the bushes, was too dark to be seen. He shivered and waited. Gradually, as he stood, he became aware of a smell. It was wholly unpleasant. Seemingly, it came from the weed, yet mixed with the vegetable odour that was one of another kind of decay. A soft, oozy bubbling accompanied it. Gases must be rising from the mud at the bottom. It would not do to stay in this place and risk his health. He stooped, still puzzled by the disappearance of the frogs, and stared once more at the dark surface. Pulling his net into a ready position, he tried the throaty call for the last time. Instantly, he threw himself backwards with a cry. A vast belching bubble of foul air shot from the pool. Another gushed up past his head, then another. Great patches of slimy weed were flung high amongst the thorn branches. The whole pond seemed to boil. He turned blindly to escape and stepped into the thorns. He was in agony. A dreadful slobbering deafened his ears. The stench overcame his senses. He felt the net whipped from his hand. The icy weeds were wet on his face. Reeds lashed him. Then he was in the midst of an immense pulsating softness that yielded and received and held him. He knew he was shrieking. He knew there was no one to hear him. An hour after the sun had risen, the rain slackened to a light drizzle. A policeman cycled slowly on the road that ran by the cottage, shaking out his cape with one hand and half expecting the old man to appear and call out a comment on the weather. Then he caught sight of the lamp still burning feebly in the kitchen and dismounted. He found the door ajar and wondered if something was wrong. He called to the old man. He saw the uncommon handiwork lying on the table, as if it had suddenly been dropped, and the unused bed. For half an hour the policeman searched the neighbourhood of the cottage, calling out the old man's name at intervals, before remembering the pond. He turned towards the stile. Climbing over it, he frowned and began to hurry. He was disturbed by what he saw. On the bank of the pond crouched a naked figure. The policeman went closer. He saw it was the old man, on his haunches. His arms were straight, the hands resting between his feet. He did not move as the policeman approached. "Hello there," said the policeman. He ducked to avoid the thorn bushes catching his helmet. "This won't do, you know. You can get into trouble." He saw green slime on the old man's beard and the staring eyes. His spine chilled. With an unprofessional distaste, he quickly put out a hand and took the old man by the upper arm. It was cold. He shivered and moved the arm gently. Then he groaned and ran away from the pond. For the arm had come away at the shoulder. Reeds and green water plants and slime tumbled from the broken joint. And as the old man fell backwards, tiny green stitches glistened across his belly. So, thank you for joining me tonight. I hope you enjoyed tonight's story. I shall do another one, again with no strong language or particularly graphic violence or anything like that. So if you're enjoying everyone gathering around and having a spooky story on these autumnal